So we come on retreat with intentions, beautiful intentions. And I always find it so moving to hear people speak, to voice what brings them to the practice, wanting silence, stillness, depth in the practice, wanting to connect with wisdom and compassion as deeply as one can. And we come to the practice, all of us, for our own individual reasons. Something got us started meditating, some kind of suffering, usually. Perhaps just touched by the world and by the difficulty of living in this world. We come to practice seeking balance, ease, understanding. And we never know what a retreat will hold. We never have any idea what we'll meet this week. But we're called here for some reason. And now we've had one day of practice, and intention begins to meet the practice. It can be interesting. But the beauty of this tradition is this has been done before us by many, many other people. I take quite a lot of reassurance from the fact that I didn't make this up. And you should take quite a lot of reassurance from the fact that I have not made this up. I'm not a life coach with my own particular ideas of, how to be a good human being. I actually am sometimes as confused as everybody else. But the Buddha wasn't confused. And we can take confidence in this because he taught us what he knew from his own experience. We take refuge in the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha before we chant the precepts for good reason. Because it's like putting up an umbrella in the rain. It keeps us, it feels like protection. And taking refuge in the fact that the Buddha, like us, was a human being. It's actually so reassuring. I used to be a scientist, so I don't really resonate with the mythological and religious Buddha. I don't have the kind of faith my Burmese friends have. But I do have faith in the fact that there was this person 2,600 years ago. Someone who struggled in the practice. Someone who made mistakes that almost killed him. But someone who succeeded in spite of that. And I'm probably not the only person in this room who has the occasional thought, oh, I wish I could meet the real Buddha, what it would have been like to be in his presence. But it's almost as though the Buddha anticipated that wish from all of us, because he was famous for saying, one who sees the Buddha sees the Dharma, one who sees the Dharma sees the Buddha. So if we see the Dhamma, if we understand the way things are, we have seen the Buddha. And these precious teachings that he offered have been passed down generation upon generation upon generation, scholars and yogis, and they come to us. And they work. This is just the most wonderful thing to see. Maybe we don't immediately see it in ourselves, but the longer I practice, the more confidence I have, not just from my own experience, but from people I've met. Regular people like all of you. Not to mention my teachers in Burma who always say, well, I didn't start out this way. The Dhamma is described as beautiful in the beginning, beautiful in the middle, and beautiful in the end. Seeing clearly is always beautiful from the very beginning of the practice to the very ending of it. And a good part of this beauty is what it offers us as human beings in this complicated world. Because the world is not a safe, secure, or stable place. It wasn't at the time of the Buddha, and it isn't certainly now. But we all have inherited and walk on a path that leads us directly to freedom from suffering on account of all that. And the refuge in Sangha, the refuge in each other, if nothing else, is such an incredible support along the way. Traditionally in Asia, this means, the community of monks. It can also mean the community of noble ones, those who have attained some serious insight, some path and fruition knowledge. And in the West, often it's used in general to basically describe just the community of practitioners who are walking this path together. And it's not a traditional meaning, but I like it a lot. Because as I said in the beginning of this retreat, the beginning of the Metta retreat, we create together the container of this retreat practice. Together we do this practice. And together we can do this practice. Sometimes it seems like it would be impossible alone. And in fact, when Ananda, the Buddha's chief attendant, went to him and said, spiritual friendship is half of the holy life, the Buddha said to him, no, Ananda, don't say that. Spiritual friendship is the whole of the holy life. So, supported by these refuges, protected by these refuges, we take up the practice. And I was reflecting today about those of you who've just arrived coming on retreat, how it must have been like for the Buddha when he left home. Because we've all left home, and here we are. I can imagine the preparation, the thought, I really need to do this. And the story of his life actually is very, very much the story of our lives, because he had lived an incredibly comfortable life. When he was born, his father consulted an astrologer who told him, this baby is really special. He'll either be a wheel-turning monarch, in other words, a great king, or a Buddha. And of course you can imagine what his father preferred. His father was a king himself, so of course, good, I got a son who's going to be even greater than I am. So from that moment on, the Buddha-to-be was protected from anything remotely negative, and was provided with multiple palaces and, armies of dancing girls and, whatever he wanted in the sense realm. When he was 16, he married an incredibly beautiful princess and had a son, and then got curious, because what's outside the palace walls? Eventually, it's like, well, what's going on out there? And so he had his charioteer sneak him out of the palace to just have a look at the real world out there. The first time they went out, he saw a really old person, and he said to his charioteer, Chana, what's wrong with that person? And Chana told him, well, it's an old person. Everybody gets old. And the Buddha said, even me? And his charioteer said, all of us. And the Buddha said, let's go home. And then they went out. He was, it's like there was something that caught him there, and he's like, I really do want to see more. So on successive occasions, Chana took him out. He saw the old person first, then he saw a sick person, and the corpse of somebody who had died. And each time seeing these, it was like, no, take me home. The fourth time they went out, he saw a renunciate, very serene, walking down the road. And in India then, as now, there were many people, sadhus, who had left home and were doing spiritual practice. It's like, Chana, what's that man doing? Who is that? And Chana said, well, that's a renunciate. He's left home and he's devoting himself to his spiritual practice. And the Buddha-to-be was hooked. And so one night he snuck out of the palace and never came back. Not as a prince. He came back some years later as the Buddha. This is, it's a dramatic story. But we do something like this when we come on retreat. We leave behind the comforts of home and predictability and our identities, and we come here. And we don't know what we're going to meet, but we come here and we just dive in. And it's easy to say, well, that was the Buddha. Nobody does that anymore. And not only do we do it in our own way, but people do still do this, actually. So I want to share the story of one person who did do this, and whose story I find incredibly inspiring for my own practice. Because this is a person who left home with a lot of confidence, and immediately fell into challenge that was surprising. And in the Buddha's story, we don't get much detail after he left home about the challenges he faced. In terms of the challenges he faced immediately after leaving home, and the effect that must have had on his system, it must have been such a shock. Leaving the palace, leaving his family, leaving everything, and suddenly with nothing. But not so many years ago, maybe 8 or 10 at this point, there was quite a well-known Tibetan Rinpoche who did exactly the same thing. His name is Mingyur Rinpoche. He's the son of Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche, so real Tibetan royalty, basically. From his smallest childhood, he was treated as, somebody quite exalted. And when he was 13, he entered his first 3-year retreat. And by the time he was in his 20s, he'd done 3 of those. And by early 2000s, he had quite a following of students, really becoming somebody in the Dharma world. I'm trying to remember which year. It was 2007. I did a retreat with him, and he is a wonderful teacher, really quite remarkable. But he had long held this desire to do a wandering retreat. And when his father was still alive, he asked him, what do you think? Should I do it? And his father said, are you sure you want to do this? And he said, yes. And his father gave him the advice, if you do it, just leave. Don't tell anybody. Don't even tell your mother. Don't tell the family. Don't tell your students. Just vanish. So he began to plan this by putting out to his students that he wanted to enter a time of retreat. And nobody thought anything of it because, okay, well, he'll just, go to some monastery and we'll take care of him. But keeping it very much to himself, he began to plan how to slip out and just disappear. And he was living at the time at his big monastery in Bodh Gaya, which was very, very well protected by walls and locks and gates and yeah, he was there. He figured out how he could get out in the middle of the night without alerting anybody. And it took quite a lot of preparation and planning, dealing with locks and getting a routine where nobody would disturb him before noon and all sorts of things he had to do. And his main intention for that retreat was to, quote unquote, add wood to the fire. And in the Tibetan tradition, that expression means purposely putting yourself in a difficult situation and then using it as practice. Deliberately bringing difficulties into the foreground and then being forced to work with them directly. So here's a guy, he's in his 30s, mid-30s, he's never handled money, he's never been alone in the world, he's never done anything for himself. He threw his backpack over the monastery fence, unlocked the gate, walked out, locked it behind him. And that was that. And so there he was, 11 o'clock at night. Bodh Gaya, I don't know if any of you have been there, but it's not the safest part of the world. With a locked gate behind him, maybe $150 worth of rupees in his pocket, and that was it. And he had joyfully kind of anticipated what it would be like, as he was planning it, how it would be to be free and to be just a wandering itinerant yogi. And here's his account of what it was like. When he gets to the gate, right before he leaves, he says, I unlocked the padlock, pushed back the gate, and slipped through. My heart burst with fear and exhilaration. The darkness of night seemed to light up and absorb all my thoughts, leaving just the shocking sensation of being on the other side of the fence, in the dead of night, alone outside in the world for the first time in my adult life. I had to force myself to move. Here's this guy, he's done a lot of spiritual practice. And where, what we say in English, when the rubber meets the road, it's like, oh wow, maybe I threw too much wood on the fire. And it gets interesting immediately because the taxi he had ordered, kind of secretly, didn't show up. And he's fumbling around in the mud and, ends up walking down the road. Finally, the car comes, he gets in the car. Oh, it's just kind of chaos. He has a moment in the car to take a couple of deep breaths. He gets to the Gaia station, gets out, has to figure out how to buy a ticket. He buys a third-class ticket. Any of you who've been in India, a third-class ticket? Ooh, interesting. And he finds himself on the platform in the crush of humanity that is India, with no safety around him. He says, as the atmosphere became increasingly claustrophobic, pressing in on me like a physical weight, the plan to add fuel to the fire steadily became a reality. And this was just the beginning. Exploring the true nature of my being was causing the flames to burn a bit sooner than I had anticipated. And he had this thought, I've been away from my monastery for an hour. Have I already reached my limit? And one thing he said, I wanted to hide, but I have nowhere to go. And he says, at the same time, a sense of stability cultivated by a lifetime of practice was also present, but it felt quite fragile in a way that I wasn't used to. So here we all are with our little stack of wood in front of us. Perhaps today also wondering, what the heck was I thinking? But we locked the gate behind us. And we don't have any choice but just to dive in. Just as Mingyur Rinpoche did, as another human being. And his account of his time, his first 2 weeks out in the world like that, is so beautiful because he's very humble, speaking of his panic attacks and all sorts of things that were happening to him. And also how the practice was holding him. And within 2 weeks of leaving his monastery, he had almost died of cholera. And just because of a little karmic luck, he was able he ended up in a hospital. And then he just went on with his practice. Emerging 4 years later as a much more humble, less youthfully cocky human being with an even more mature sense of wisdom and compassion, understanding of that. The Buddha, Mingyur Rinpoche, it's easy for us to discount these experiences because we're not them, but just like us. These are examples that we can follow. And I really love how Mingyur Rinpoche's openness about describing his terror and his shame and his embarrassment and his confusion, I find it very humanizing. He's not some Rinpoche up there who's, spiritually advanced, but no, he's a human being just like us. We can really take a lot of reassurance from this. Others have done this, so can we. And what we come here to do, to deepen our practice, is exactly that same thing. We each want to put more wood on the fire. Just in our own way to deepen our resilience, to deepen our wisdom, to deepen our compassion by directly confronting whatever difficulties might arise. We have these beautiful intentions, and then we need balanced effort to do that. If we meet our fear and whatever other difficulties we might face with force, that's destructive. I said this morning, and I'll expand in another talk, about how our difficulties are our very place of practice. This is our doorway in. The only way we become wiser, kinder, more resilient is to directly face our demons and to come to a new relationship with them. The armor of a warrior is not force. The armor of a Dharma warrior is right effort. In the classic sense, basically what that means is cultivating what is wholesome and refraining from what is unwholesome. So it's restraint around unwholesome mind states that might arise, not getting involved in them. It's abandoning the ones that come up again and again, just putting them down over and over again. It's the development of wholesome states that have not yet arisen, but are latent, and the preservation of the ones that have already arisen. This is a huge protection in the practice. To Understand that in the practice, as we put wood on the fire, all sorts of unwholesome mind states will arise. Habitual ones, all those old habits. And some new ones, as Mingyur Rinpoche just beautifully described. Not to get involved in them, but to have a metta attitude. It's this attitude of kind, friendly interest. That's what puts them down. We don't feed these habitual states directly by way of getting involved in them, or indirectly by way of resisting them. So we don't feed these unwholesome habits directly by getting involved in them, or indirectly by way of resisting them. We need to have that metta attitude that just says, whoa, fear has arisen. Fear feels like this. And then not getting involved in the thoughts about that fear, not building that fear, not making an identity around that fear, but just feeling it. So this deepening we desire in the practice results from surrendering to what happens when we put wood on the fire, and finding that kind attitude just to allow that state to be, so that we can directly observe it and understand it exactly the way it is. The shorthand version of all this is the only way out is in. So we meet the heat of what happens when we throw wood on the fire with the supports of this metta attitude, with whatever comes up. Whether it's the heat of throwing wood on the fire, those difficult emotions, those difficult habits, those difficult states, or just the fact that the mind can't settle down and we have a lot of gaps and we can't be mindful 1 minute. So there's this kind, patient attitude with whatever is arising, and we just keep going. Mahasi Sayadaw, who was such a warrior, spoke often of patience. No doubt he understood more than most of us where the mind can go when you throw wood on the fire. And in his Manual of Insight, he speaks about the beginning of a retreat in a really lovely, kind way, acknowledging that at the beginning of a retreat, there are going to be a lot of gaps in your noticing and a lot of gaps in your noting, but not to be frustrated by that. Because with this attitude to observe kindly and carefully, it will all come together. So whether we're dealing with really difficult things or just everyday on retreat frustrations, practicing with this wholehearted attitude of kindness and patience is what provides us with the protection to keep going and allows us to naturally deepen. And it gives us the courage to be able to feel things. Often things we've been avoiding our whole lives, not even aware of that, but then we see, and then we can go in and see clearly. It's by way of this kind surrender to the way things are and a willingness to observe that is what allows us to gain in equanimity, resiliency, and insight, which is, of course, what all of us want. And the Buddha was really clear. He said in the Majjhima Nikaya, "Bhikkhus, if it were not possible to refrain from the unwholesome, I would not ask you to do it. But it is possible. Bhikkhus, I would not ask you to cultivate the wholesome if it were not possible to do it. But it is possible to do that." And so the Buddha directly asks us to look, to have the patience to observe what might be difficult to observe, to add our little sticks to the fire and to feel the heat. And we can do it. We might not be enlightened as fast as we want, but we're all going in the right direction. And we'll all get there if we keep walking, taking refuge in the fact that people have done this before. Taking refuge in the fact that they too, just like us, were freaked out, but they kept going. Taking refuge in the fact that they were surprised how hard it was, but they kept going. Taking refuge in the fact that the Buddha saw the way through, and many other beings have. And so can we. I want to close with a verse from the Dhammapada. that I find very, very inspiring in this way. People threatened by fear go to many refuges, to mountains, forests, parks, trees. None of these is a secure refuge. None is a supreme refuge. Not by going to such a refuge is one released from all suffering. But when someone takes refuge in the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, and sees with insight the Four Noble Truths, then this is the supreme refuge. So in this very retreat, may we all find safe, secure refuge in the Four Noble Truths. Thank you for your kind attention, everybody. Let's sit for a moment and let the words settle.